Good morning, welcome, Tansi. Kaniibut Wapshki and Dejnikas. My spirit name is Standing White Bear. I introduce myself in the Anishinaabe language out of respect for the people of the territory and their practices here and the friendships that led to having that name. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This commitment is one of the many reasons that we're pleased to host events like the one we're having today, conversations that challenge our thinking, deepen our understanding, and help us to move forward reconciled. We'll begin with a blessing from Elder Mary Wilson. Mary has worked as an elder and spiritual care person in several capacities. She's known to many as grandmother of 4 directions and she who walks with wolves. She joined the University of Manitoba section of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Health in November of 2015.
I'm a little shorter, but I'm still growing, so it might take me a little while. If I can only reach 6'1" like my mother was. So, Anin, Tansei, Bonjour, and hello. My name is Mary Wilson, that's my English name. But my name is Grandmother of 4 Directions. And my other name is Walks with Wolves. And I was given those names because I would do the work, actually, of more than one person. I am a wolf clan mother. And even though my original people are not from here, I was born on Treaty 1. So I want to welcome you to a wonderful gathering where you will have your minds opened. Creator, thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for bringing us together to all our relations, bringing all the directions in one room, bringing visionaries, hardworking people, creative people, bringing them together so they may make a difference in our future for the 7 generations to come. Thank you, Creator, for watching over us as we grow. Even through their stumbling, we can get up one more time and go ahead and do the things in life that need to be done. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to share my gifts as a spirit walker and as a visionary and a healer with the people around here. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to be open and honest about who I am and where I'm going, so I may share and bring inspiration to other people as they discover who they are. Thank you, Creator, for allowing all of us to stand strong together in unity for the future generations, as I said, from 7 generations to all our winged ones, to the 4-leggeds, to the water ones, to all that is alive. We thank you, Creator, for giving us life. Thank you, Creator, for our minds and our spirits and the hearts that drive us forward. Oh.
Thank you. One of our special guests has asked to bring greetings to welcome everyone to Treaty 1 territory. So Jerry Daniels is the Grand Chief of the Southern Chiefs Organization, representing 33 communities in southern Manitoba, proud member of Long Plain First Nation, and an alumnus of this university. Please welcome Grand Chief Jerry Daniels.
Bonjour, Deno Magdak, Ogimam Kodishnakas, Kaganushte Agdunji, Banasi Dudem. My name is Jerry Daniels. I was once an attendee of the Kelowna Accord, and that was the first time I ever met Paul. quite a number of years ago. I was on the National Association of Friendship Centers Youth Council at that time. So I'm very honored to see the work continue and to have some of our great leaders here who are mentors to me, provided great knowledge to the Youth Council when I was part of the Assembly of First Manitoba Chiefs as well. So I welcome you all on behalf of the Treaty 1 territory and the chiefs and leadership of Treaty 1, the people of Treaty 1. We are in an age of building understanding and bridging partnership and seeing ourselves in one another, and that our future is a shared future. And that is the age that we are in. And I'm encouraged by these kinds of discussions, the visions of our leaders, and I encourage our young people as much as possible to be involved in the critiquing of our community policies and to push towards more comprehensive community planning in our communities. Education is a very important part of that. And there's a lot of studies that have happened, like traditional usage studies, that could be a part of our educational system, because it is a true reflection of what our community's history truly was, and to develop our vision for the future at the local level, which is very important, and that's the role that I play. So thank you all, my relatives. Chi miigwech.
Thank you, Grand Chief Daniels. I'd like to welcome some special guests that are joining us here today, a number of special guests. Elder Mary Kershane, of course, Elder Margaret Lavallee, Elder Don Robertson, Jean-Vianney Auclair, Assistant Deputy Minister of Manitoba Education and Training, the Honourable Dr. Ray Pagdican, former Minister of Veteran Affairs for Canada and former MP of Winnipeg North, Cheryl Pauls, President of Canadian Mennonite University, Conrad Jonasson, President and Vice Chancellor of University College of the North, and a special welcome to students who will join us soon from Southeast Collegiate with their instructor, Billy Nepanak, and students from Seguin Anishinaabe High School and their teachers, Alan Kershane and Liz Gray, who will be here in a few minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator and speakers. We're honored this morning, truly honored, to have with us as the moderator the Right Honourable Paul Martin, originally from Ontario, but he was known to us mostly as Prime Minister in Canada from 2003 to 2006 and Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Mr. Martin set in place a 10-year, $41 billion plan to improve health care and reduce wait times, signed agreements with provinces and territories to establish the first national early learning and childcare program, and created a new financial deal for Canada's municipalities. Under his leadership, the Canadian government reached an historic deal with Indigenous peoples of Canada to eliminate the existing funding gaps in health, education, and housing, known as the Kelowna Accord, which has already been referenced. After leaving public life, Mr. Martin created the Martin Family Initiative, focusing on the early childhoods and elementary and secondary education of Indigenous children and youth. So on behalf of the University of Manitoba, sir, thank you sincerely for joining us today and helping to lead this conversation. We're also grateful to have exceptional panelists with us today. First, Stephen Khaki, who served as the president of the Dene Nation from 1983 to 1987. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories in 1987 and served as Premier of the Northwest Territories from 2000 through 2003. Mr. Khaki is currently Senior Advisor to the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, as well as the founder, president, and CEO of Canadians for a New Partnership. Our next panelist this afternoon will be Ovid Mercredi. Mr. Mercredi is well known to us here. We used to be friends. He was one of the student leaders who established the first Native Students Association of Canada and the Indian and Eskimo Student Center. He went on to be elected National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations in 1991 and served until 1997. Mr. Mercredi also served as Chief of the Mississippiwistic Cree Nation from 2005 to 2011. He currently sits on the Board of Directors of Canadians for a New Partnership. Our final panelist was originally scheduled to be Audrey Poitras, President of the Métis Nation of Alberta. However, she's not feeling well today, unable to attend. We hope she's feeling better soon. We're pleased to welcome to our panel today Solange Lalonde. Ms. Lalonde is the Associate Director of Education for Rupert's Land Institute, Métis Centre of Excellence. She has an extensive background in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit education and professional development, and has led a province-wide initiative on focused on building educator capacity and educating learners. She's recently collaborated on 2 scholarly publications, a chapter entitled The Alberta Métis Education Council, Realizing Self-Determination in Education, and the other, a publicly accessible conference proceeding entitled Responding to the Calls to Action, Indigenizing a Graduate Program. Before I call on Mr. Martin to lead the conversation, I want to speak briefly about how this event came about. Almost 2 years ago, Paul and I met here in Winnipeg to discuss bringing together Indigenous leaders from across the country to share knowledge and perspectives. In particular, we wanted to highlight issues relating to Indigenous education at different levels, K-12 and post-secondary. In our province, education partners have come together to commit to the Manitoba Collaborative Indigenous Education Blueprint for universities, colleges, and public school boards, which was signed on this campus in December of 2015. The blueprint makes excellence in Indigenous education a priority, and together with the partners, we'll soon release an implementation plan that outlines our path and advances reconciliation. This university is dedicated to advancing Indigenous education through sharing knowledge, creating a foundation for learning, promoting student success, and developing leaders. The Martin family's work is committed to walking alongside Indigenous experts, communities, and leaders to ensure that the educational opportunities from birth through to secondary school for Indigenous children are as good as any in the country and are culturally appropriate. Today's roundtable brings together these mutual goals, offers knowledge, discussion, and perspectives from leaders across the country, Dene, Métis, and Cree. The success and well-being of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples is interwoven with all of our futures. Together, we're acting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's recommendations and seeking steps that will advance reconciliation in this province and this country. As we celebrate our 140th anniversary at the university and the 150th birthday of Canada, it's time to reflect on our past and chart our future. So I'm humbled today seeing all of you in the room who are eager to carry this critical conversation forward. So it's time to do that. And I turn now to our moderator, the Right Honourable Paul Martin.
The point that I was trying to make is I have a lot of old friends here, but I just had a shock. Ray Pactacan and I were in cabinet together. I hadn't seen him in a while. And I looked out, and I basically said to him, he had a magnificent head of black hair. And I looked up and I said, what happened to all of that black hair? And then he looked at me and he said, what happened to your hair, period? So I'm not sure. And now I've been shut off by the mic. First of all, I want to congratulate you, Dr. Bernard. And I want to congratulate the university for gathering us today. I thank you because the future of Indigenous Canada is at stake. For me, this is the single most important moral issue that we face as a country, because it goes to the heart of who we are and what we stand for as a people. In speaking to the issue, the TRC said that reconciliation is key, and that the essence of reconciliation is truth and empowerment. Well, the Commission itself dealt with the issue of truth, and it dealt with the issue of truth unequivocally. I think we can be very proud of its findings and the way in which it went about it. But in terms of empowerment, we have a long way to go before the First Nations, the Métis Nation, or the Inuit will have full empowerment. Now, it's not easy, some will say, to empower people after 300 years of attempted assimilation and forced dependency. But we cannot flinch from the need to act, and we have to act now. We have wasted enough time, and the time for excuses is over. Now, hence the importance of today's discussion, in which 3 outstanding Indigenous leaders will tell us how they approach the challenge of empowering their people. And to begin with, I will start with Stephen Khaki. To simply say, Stephen, you're the Premier of the Northwest Territories. You're the founder of Canadians for a New Dialogue. Could you describe for us your experiences, your successes, and your lessons learned in the empowerment of Indigenous Canada?
Used to be just ministers and priests that walked up and spoke from these. So my experiences, I must say that it started after getting out of residential school. I think the colonization of our people up the north went on for a couple of hundred years, and they did a very thorough job of it. So in the early 70s, I should say, a huge number of us came out of residential school, and at that time, grade 12 was like a PhD today. There wasn't a lot of us that had a grade 12, and most of the people that grew up with went back on the land, hunting, trapping. And so there were just a few of us that, after residential school, kept going to school. And so the leadership of our people fell to us. And the success of what we did in my hometown, in the Northwest Territories, is defined by a number of things. One, that we talked about, who are we? What do we call ourselves? Why are we here? And what is it we want to do? First of all, we said, we're not Indians, we're Dene. We're not Eskimos, we're Inuit. We're Inuvialuit. And we did not want a pipeline that was proposed for our land in 1974. So the question was, well, what do you want? And I remember my father saying, when I was 23 years old, he was very amused, and he said, tell me again, what are you going to do? I said, well, we're going to take back all the land. We're going to take over the government. We're going to put some of our people in Ottawa, in the Senate, in the House of Commons. And we're going to rename our communities, take over the schools, manage our wildlife. And he said, you sure you're going to do all that? I said, yeah, I want to do all that. It's good to be young and naive, you know. And it's almost like somebody said, go ahead and do all that while you still think you can. And so the elders actually let us take the lead during the Berger inquiry that spoke about what is your position regarding the pipeline. We talked about it and said, we don't want the pipeline. We have a plan for ourselves, our land. And so we had elders working with young people like myself. And what we struggled with was trying to find the words, trying to find a way to express ourselves that was our own message. And we talked about the plans that we had. And another critical thing that happened where I think things became successful was one day the chief said, you know, the Territorial Council, which was mostly appointed as a new founded government for the Northwest Territories, suddenly was going to become fully elected. This government was only set up in '67. It was a commissioner, a dictatorship. But by 1979, it went to a fully elected. And the chiefs said, we want some of you to get yourself elected on that legislature and become ministers, and so that when we ask for a meeting with the government, you are sitting on the other side. And I was one of the ones, I was very militant, I thought. Angry, definitely. radical. And I said, I will have nothing to do with that government. It's a colonial government. It's not my government. And I would die before I ever set foot in that place. Well, 10 years later, I stepped into that place. And the vision and the vision of the elders and the old chiefs is so clear, because since then we've had a succession of Indigenous people being the premier of the Northwest Territories, including myself, and Nellie Cornway, and Jim Antoine, and Donnie Morin, and Bob McLeod today. We've also, in that motion, there was also a motion to get somebody into the Senate. We have Nick Sabiston there today. And we also had a motion to get a member of parliament into Ottawa. And we've had Ethel Blondin so far. We had Wally Firth before that. And today we have Mike McLeod. So all to say that those were the successes that we had. And I think it came in the context of saying, we have been under the control of a foreign power, of a different people. And when we take back control and we define ourselves and we decide what we want, we always have to take what you call a praxis approach, which is action reflection. You do something and then you step back and you look at what it is you've done, and you try to measure that by saying, was that really a decolonizing piece of work, action, or was it just more neo-colonial actions taken by those that were colonized, which was most of our people at that time. So the decolonization of our people was always foremost in our minds when we did things, and we tried to do it, young people with old people.
Ovid Mercredi, a leader of the AFN, leader in his own community, across a wide range of areas. But Ovid, you have also worked with the University of Manitoba. You have worked in your own community. You've worked in a number of other communities in terms of education. You have a wide experience in what is in fact going to happen. Tell us your experiences.
My experiences, the good and the bad. Where do we begin? Mr. Paestigo in Ununina. I am a Cree from Grand Rapids. Eguteagu Pigian, that's where I was raised. And I grew up where we were the majority. I had no sense of inferiority as a Cree. And the white people in my community were the minority. And they were not in positions of power except maybe for the priest. But otherwise, I grew up in a community that was pretty much self-contained in terms of livelihood. There was no welfare when I grew up in my community. People had jobs. They had skills that they had learned over centuries from the land. They built their own homes. They spoke their own language. And they helped each other. I grew up in a community that was intact in every respect, including governance. But little did I know that there was a world out there, and a world that did not expose itself kindly to me, but a world I discovered I had to accommodate, because that world was not going to accommodate me. So that's the relationship that I was stuck with as a teenager. But I was fortunate in the sense that I had an identity. I knew who I was. I understood myself. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think I would have coped with the educational system. So I'm dealing with the bad first, see? Because the educational system that I went to required me to lose my language. Because that system did not have my language, and it didn't much care about it. And in fact, when I was in elementary school in Grand Rapids, there was no library, there's no qualified teachers, and the books that we used were books that had been handed down from school generation to school generation. And the only good thing I can say about that is that some of the answers were written down. Much to my relief. So you can see, we were never valued as a people. But I didn't know that because in my own community I was valued as a human being. I was strengthened by my people all the time. And it's important to hear your elders say to you, Nipokawa napesus. This young man is smart. He's a smart man, this young man. And when you hear that from your people, it empowers you. Because it goes right to your own psychology as a human being. It touches your heart. But then you go to a foreign school and you learn something different, that your people are inferior. That your people, for example, needed to be Christianized in order to become human beings, better people. And that they needed an education, a white education, because somehow their traditional knowledge was immaterial, of no value to their success as a people. So I ended up going to high school in Nepal. By that time, my community had been exposed to more white people because of hydro development. And overnight, thousands of people showed up, more or less, overnight. And they built a school, because white people need schools. Indians don't. So they built a school to accommodate the workers from Manitoba Hydro. And that school is available to us as well, including the reserve. And I didn't live on the reserve because my mother married a Métis man, so therefore she was kicked out from the reserve, because that was the law of Canada, that a Cree woman couldn't live on the reserve if she married out. A source of anger for me. But that's a different story about how laws impact on other people's lives, laws made by foreigners on my people. But I won't go there, because I'm telling a story about education, the bad part of it. And I have 5 minutes. So we're doing good here. We're doing really good. Anyhow, what can I say? My mother decided, I guess my parents decided at some point I should go to a different school. So I went to a residential school in Nepal. And then my mother was visited by the principal of the school in Grand Rapids. And she said to my mother, "He's not going to make it there, you know. He'd be better off here than going to Nepal." So here is someone that didn't grow up with me, never understood who I was, never saw me as a young man, couldn't see my leadership qualities even at that age, making a decision that I was incapable of graduating from high school. Maybe he was a prophet, because the story gets worse. My story with the educational system is not a positive experience. So I end up in Nepal, at that time one of the most racist towns in the province of Manitoba, where Indian and white kids were always beating up on each other on the streets of the town. And I go into this town with that kind of legacy, and I end up going to a theater along with my fellow residential students, school students, and I'm told I have to go to the Indian section of the movie theater. The Indian section's over there, and I'm sitting in the where I want to sit, in the balcony where a great man belongs. I'm just kidding you. Because at that time, my self-worth is intact. I'm not feeling inferior. No one's going to tell me, you go over there. So I stand my ground. And we break the system. My first experience was a political act called, which I learned later on from Mahatma Gandhi, passive resistance. A great idea. Still one that's useful today. Passive resistance. So then I have to take French. I would have preferred to take my language in high school, Cree, but it wasn't available to me. Because they're not living in my country. They're living in Canada. And Canada is a bilingual country, but it's not my country. I am not a Canadian. I am not part of this system. In Inunina, I am a Cree. That's who I am. So I had an impediment when I was a student. I still have it, but I've managed it. It's called fear of public speaking. But it's also about stuttering. I stutter. I don't know if you noticed that or not. But my father transferred that to me. And I got 3 minutes. There's so much to tell you about the bad. So I know what being first means. And I tell you, you don't want to be first all the time. Because when we used to have these school bees, these spelling bees, and we'd be lining up on one side of the hall, on the other side of the hall of the school, and we'd have competitions between the two lines to see who the smartest kid is. Now look at me. You think I'm the smartest kid there? Of course not. So I'm standing up, feeling inferior about this language to begin with. And I'm the first guy to sit down. That's what I mean. You don't want to be first all the time. And I remember when I became the national chief, my cousin Evelyn was watching television and telling her children, "That's my cousin. You can do that too, you know. You know, that guy, when he was young, he couldn't even spell cat." So you can see, like when I went to high school in Nepal, I was dealing with a totally different community. An experience I didn't have. And then the French teacher is insisting I speak French in class, and I can't speak French in class. I'm afraid to speak publicly to begin with. And I refuse to speak, and she gives me a choice, an ultimatum. Either you speak or you don't take my classes. What choice do you think I took? I used to love those French fries at the McLaren Hotel, because during the French class, that's where I'd end up. But the story of that, the short story of that is that I didn't finish my grade 11 because of that. I didn't have French, and I only have a partial grade 12. That's the bad story. The second story, I don't have time to tell you. I only have 1 minute. But that second story involves this institution. Thank you.
Solange Lalonde is the Associate Director of Education for the Rupert's Land Institute, which is the Métis Center of Excellence. And the question, Solange, is in the context of empowerment. What are your experiences in trying to improve education, and what are some of the different challenges and some of the different opportunities facing Métis education?
Thank you, and thank you for this warm welcome to this territory and for the prayers this morning to begin us. I'm here kind of as a last minute, and President Audrey Poitras has had to take a sick day for one of the first times in over 20 years, so I find myself in this unlikely position. And I'm speaking to you as an educator. I'm a teacher. I've taught middle school and high school, and I'm also speaking to you as an Associate Director of Métis Education for Rupert's Land Institute. And so I feel very privileged to be able to share some of the things that we're doing in Alberta, and I'm going to share some experiences that might resonate in your communities as well for your students and for education, especially when we're looking at opportunities. One of the approaches that we're taking is building capacity and system excellence, really focusing on how can we build the capacity of our educators, our system leaders, and our community. One of the things that I've found in professional learning is that often people think that the knowledge is somewhere else. They think they need to fly somebody in. They think they need to buy that resource from another area. A huge part of what we're doing is building that awareness. The knowledge and wisdom is in the knowledge and wisdom is in the community, and the real key is the engagement. And what does that process of engagement look like when we can have a dialogue together? Dr. Alan Luke conducted one of the biggest studies on the achievement gap, the Indigenous achievement gap in Australia, and he asked thousands of educators, if there was a new teacher coming to your school, what would they need to know about teaching Indigenous students? And he asked principals, if there was a new principal coming to your school, what would they need to know about teaching Indigenous students? And he gathered all of this data and then analyzed it. One of the things that he found, it was overwhelmingly deficit model thinking. Oh, lack of this, can't do this, don't have this. It was all deficit thinking, and these are from the educators. And so looking at some of the story of another place where colonization has really had a huge influence on education, how can that inform the work that we're doing? In his study, engagement was one of the key pieces as well. And so we're looking, how can we have that process of engagement, but also how can we take a strength-based approach? How can we, through professional learning opportunities, find ways to take that strength-based approach so that more and more people can start to understand the richness and the vibrancy of our communities. At Rupert's Land Institute, we've established the Alberta Métis Education Council, and this is a volunteer advisory group which helps guide and provide direction for the work that we're doing. It's an amazing experience to be able to work in community, and what we're introducing to other areas is what does it look like when we have a collective approach? Just because my title might say Associate Director of Education, I certainly don't come with all the knowledge and wisdom. That needs to come through community. And so we have 4 objectives that we're working on. And the first is research-informed practice. So we're starting from that scholarly perspective. We're looking to see what's already been done. What community members can we draw upon in guiding our work and informing our work? We're also working on building capacity and finding different ways that we can do that. And I'll share a couple of the things that we're doing in just a little bit. The third thing that we're working on is curriculum development. Curricular development for educational resources and tools, not only for the teaching aspect, for what's happening in grades kindergarten to grade 12, but also what's happening in professional learning. We have a unique situation where our students are learning alongside of our educators, alongside of our leadership. And so what does that look like when we can be providing some Métis resources from a Métis perspective? And the fourth objective is collaboration, looking for some partnerships with a diverse group of educators in post-secondary and K-12, and also within different communities. A few of the things that we're working on for building capacity, one is the brain architecture game. Has anyone here played the brain architecture game? A few. I see a couple of nods. The brain architecture game, what it does is it connects early life experiences and brain development. So we provide facilitator training so that we use it as an entry point to talk about the Métis experience in residential schools. Always looking for entry points and experiential activity. We're looking for that pedagogical shift, that deep shift in understanding. So we're going from knowing the facts, knowing the history, but also reaching deeper. How does that impact my understanding of my community and my students? And most importantly, my role as an educator. What can we do? Often when we start getting into the history, there's an incredible process where people get overwhelmed and they stop. So we need to kind of flood when we talk about empowerment. How do we empower educators with resources and tools so they can move from that knowing, ways of knowing, to ways of understanding as well? One of the other activities we do is a community action poverty simulation, and we use this as an engagement tool. Often what we need to do with educators is build their awareness of the obstacles and the issues associated with poverty, and also the incredible resources and tools that are out there so that educators can start helping connect to not only the issues but the resources within their own community. Again, the wisdom and knowledge is within those communities and finding different ways. The third activity that we're doing in our professional learning is land-based activities. So we have a 3-day educator camp that's coming up, where we're doing some activities in the classroom and with community, but we're spending an entire day on land-based activities. We're going to Métis Crossing, taking a Voyageur canoe down to Victoria Settlement, traditional Métis plant use. So just finding ways so that educators can be spending time with community members and learning from the places that are important to us. Part of this question was also about looking at the challenges and the opportunities. So I think one of the biggest challenges is negotiating that lived experience with the academic and the education piece. How can we bring those two together? And I think it's really about establishing that relational space where we can have a collective voice. And I speak to this right in specifically to curriculum development. When we're looking at curriculum development, there's a danger in a single thread. If we look at a Métis sash, the strength is in all of the threads that are put together. We can't expect a single person to be the voice of the community or to have the collective knowledge of our entire nation. So one thing that we're advocating for is finding ways so that we can create that space so our perspective can come in its entirety, not just a thread, not to embody or to incorporate, but how can we have that holistic perspective? And we're hoping that we can do that and have more opportunities to do that, especially with curriculum development. In terms of the opportunities, this is very exciting. I don't know if you're familiar with Alberta. Right now, they're advancing quality standards, professional quality standards for teachers, principals, and superintendents. And I'm going to share the process that the Ministry of Education went through, as well as some of the opportunities that we have moving forward. So through Rupert's Land Institute, we were engaged right in the design and in the drafting of the words for this teaching quality standard and the quality standard for principals and superintendents. It was absolutely incredible to be sitting there with Métis community members, First Nation community members, Inuit community members, and we had the opportunity to have a voice in what does this standard look like? What are the words we're going to use? How are we going to have a voice in this process? And so it was exciting because we would go, there would be one draft, the very next draft would have the information and the voice and the words of the community right up until the document went to cabinet. So Alberta is in that unique situation where we have a cohesive system coming forward for these professional quality standards. And the exciting part is that one of those competencies is the competency where educators are being asked to demonstrate that they have acquired and applied foundational knowledge of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so, and then there are indicators, and one of those indicators include First Nations, treaties with First Nations. And then another bullet says legislation and negotiations with the Métis people. It also talks about residential schools and languages and all of these issues that are so important. So it's very exciting that this is going to be part of our conversations, which goes back to the question, how is empowering different than delegating? Because now we're looking at quality standards changing. How can we help our educators to feel empowered? So one of the things that we're doing with the Alberta Métis Education Council is that we have, the council has established 6 themes to really form the basis of foundational knowledge. So those are languages, governance and recognition, traditions and cultures, homeland history, pre- and post-Confederation, Métis in the province of Alberta, and Métis today. So they've established these themes, and now it's the exciting part of reaching out to our community members so that we have that input. What is important to include in this foundational knowledge? We believe that the community has that wisdom and guidance, that foundational knowledge and those resources need to come from a Métis perspective, from the Métis community, for educators, for all students. And so we're very excited to be moving forward with that. And I'm also very happy to be able to share what that actually looked like, because sometimes when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about empowerment, You know, having a voice is definitely one of those key pieces. When we're looking at educational policy and educational programming, if we look at the history, you can ask two questions. Whose voice is this? And whose voice is missing? And often our Indigenous perspectives have been missing in the story within the policy, within the curriculum, and with the planning. I don't know how many else of you have been invited to launches and validations, but it's time to be part of the design and the writing and the creation of the future policy and programming that comes forward. Thank you.
Just to give you a bit of a look ahead as to how we're going to deal, there will be one other question, a common question, a short question, which will be put to each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. I must say I could not help to think as I listened to each panelist of the statement by Charles Taylor, the eminent philosopher, who essentially said that the issue that we've got to face up to is that no Indigenous student should have to leave their identity at the door in order to graduate. And I think that came through very clear. And on that basis, beginning with you, Stephen, the question to put to both to Ovid and to Solange as well is, as we continue the work of empowering Indigenous peoples, of improving education, working towards reconciliation, the question now is where we go from here. What happens next?
Okay, again, thank you. I think one of the things that needs to happen, at least in my experience, is, you know, we're involved in many great things, and I said earlier we're into defining ourselves. In 1975, for instance, we were probably the first Indigenous group in Canada to declare ourselves as a nation. We issued what we call the Dena Declaration, and it was a defining moment for us. What I regret, I guess, or what I think now that I'm 66 and going down the road, is the appreciation and knowledge and awareness of the importance of spirituality. When I came out of residential school after almost 8 years, I didn't want to have anything to do with churches and religion and God. The God that I learned about wasn't a very loving, kind, compassionate being at all. In fact, it wasn't even my God. I was supposed to be grateful he even paid attention to me. In all the years that I've worked, I've always said, you know what, you guys go pray. I'm going to go and do something. I didn't believe in prayer. I didn't believe in connecting to the Creator. It's that, you know, somebody else can do that. And that is the single biggest lesson I think I learned, and it's been in the last 15 years, is to appreciate the fact that our spirituality is our power. Our spirituality is the single most important element, presence in our people. It doesn't matter where we're from. That our first commandment should be to learn about spirituality and to learn the ways of our people. I was lucky. I went to work with the chiefs at the age of 23, and I spent almost 13 years in there. I really learned the language, the culture. I went hunting. I went to all the communities in the north. I lived in all the regions. And the reconnection was powerful. I just never consciously recognized it as the spiritual reconnection I was making. And today I work with amongst others, Ovid Mercredi, Miles Richardson, the Haida leader, and Dave Christian. And Dave is there with us as a group we call the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, with an all-encompassing singular purpose of grounding us in spirituality. That as a group, everything we do has a spiritual presence to it. And it reflects, I guess, that fact that for myself in the Northwest Territories, coming from a generation, my mother went to residential school. I didn't know that. I went for 7.5 years, was just this deep, deep anger and rejection of anything to do with religion and getting that confused with spirituality. So now, last Sunday, I did a prayer in my language with a drum, and I got my 9-year-old grandson to come up and drum with me. We're trying to learn the language again. They're learning the tools you need to survive, whether it's an axe or moose hide tanning or drum songs. That is the undertaking that I've taken for my children and grandchildren, to teach them as much as I can of the ways of our people. What happens next, I think, in the Northwest Territories anyway, is it's already happening. There's a whole new generation. My children, the children of other leaders, new generation of young people, are already taking over. They are reaching back into their communities and their culture to relearn the language, to learn the cultural ways of their people, and to embrace the spiritual aspect of our way of life, unlike people like myself who miss that in our generation. So that's what I think is next. It's not my call what's next. It's the leadership in the Northwest Territories anyway is already on the stage. They're already a new cast. They're already moving. They're educated. They're being educated in a formal sense. They're also reaching, as I said, back into the culture, connecting with elders to make sure that they're well grounded in everything they have to do. At the national level, I believe on reconciliation, we've heard apologies, we've heard commitments. We now have to make sure that there is a national strategy of how, as a country, as governments, as provinces, as churches, as survivors of residential schools, as nations of Indigenous people, we work together to make sure that all the harms and wrongs inflicted and done to us as a people are addressed, and that there's a healing process underway. We need a national strategy. So far, what we've had is a lot of words. We've had piecemeal approach. People are doing little different things, but there is no overall strategy that I know of. People have called for a new proclamation to be made, a royal proclamation on reconciliation for Canada, to make that proclamation on reconciliation. There's a call then to have some sort of a binding covenant or contract between the Indigenous peoples and the governments on the action and the agreements that we need to take the proclamation of reconciliation to a level where there is something being done. And that would be some sort of a national framework that's called for in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. There's a tremendous amount of good things in there that were never addressed, and now there is time to implement and recognize that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for things like frameworks a national framework on reconciliation, a national work plan. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We need some sort of a proclamation that I said that will embody that and use that as the framework for reconciliation right across the country. So where are we on the great scheme of the universe? We're good? We're done? I'm past?
That was very, first of all, I've got to say that was very powerful, and it was worth it. I also, though, and it was worth you going overtime. I do have one problem, and that is that this is not the first time that I've moderated one of these. It is not the first time that I've been where a speaker has gone on a little too long, and Ovid Mercredi has been coming up, was the next speaker. At the last one, I went up, it was George Erasmus, and he went on much longer. And finally, I went up and stood beside him, and he ignored me totally. And then when I went up, when Ovid was speaking, I stood behind Ovid, because Ovid was speaking too long. And Ovid turned to me and he said, "You've already established the precedent with George Erasmus. We can ignore you." So, so Ovid, it's over to you.
That's an elder's way of telling you don't speak too long. Anyway, I don't think Steve went over his time, because if you notice, he talks a lot slower than I do. I get more words in than he does. I wanted to focus more on the practical things first before I deal with the more global things that we need to do here in Canada. For example, I think the universities need to go to the people. They need to go to the communities. They have to be more visible. And they've done that to varying degrees. Like, for example, the Brandon University with the teacher education program. And as a result, we have many Indigenous teachers in this province. And the School of Social Work from U of M has gone to the north to teach social work. And we have quite a few graduates as a result of that. And then we have the School of Social Work in the urban center going to the people concept. And that's very impactful, because you're recognizing where the people live, you're working with them, educating them where they live. And they become part of the whole idea of education. And also we need champions at different levels of power. Like we used to have Don Robertson, who's sitting right here, as one of our champions. And because of his leadership, we have the Access program that has been implemented in most of the universities in this province. We have to carry on with that program. We have to persuade governments that this is a good investment, that they shouldn't cut funding for further access initiatives. And this is one area they could have great impact on reducing poverty and creating a middle class within the Indigenous community. Also, when I say about going to the people, like the University College of the North has these satellites in different communities. This is the thing to do, to be visible as a university in a community. Like they have one satellite in Norway House, they have one in my community. Because they have one in my community because, well, the UCN owed me some coffee, so that's how it started. But the end result is what we have. So we need reform, institutional reform. And people need to see that their people are valued at management levels, at senior levels of administration in universities. That's a reform that's coming. We need to be more than professors, which is also happening, right? Because in my time here, when I first came here in 1972, there was only 11 self-declared Indigenous students. Now there's about 2,500 Indigenous students at this university alone. So you can see the progress. The progress is being made, and but more can be done. And then, for example, something needs to be done about the kids who are dropping out of the educational system. The Department of Education for the province of Manitoba ignores the dropout rate. And the Department of Indian Affairs has no initiative to reach out to those young people that are dropping out from the school. These young people have no future in this country. They will be having families, they will be stuck with what they have. No education, no opportunity, no jobs. And what does that mean? It means social assistance. That is not a life for anybody, unless you're really in need. Like, social assistance should not be the first response to poverty. Something else needs to be considered. Something more tangible, something that uplifts people, makes them strong. So, in my community, we were successful recently in getting some private funding from the Kim Samuel Foundation to try to do something about all those young people that dropped out of school. So we have our land-based education program that was referred to earlier. So who's teaching? The fishermen are teaching. The trappers are teaching. The elders are teaching. Some of our own professional people are teaching. But what are they teaching? The history of the Cree. The language of the Cree. The history of Grand Rapids itself. Our relationship with Hudson Bay Company. And the kinship system. Who are you related to? Where do you belong? And that too is an historical lesson, because some of the relationships will date back to the Orkney Islands in Scotland, where we have relatives who married into our community. So this is all very interesting because it's about identity, it's about foundation. And that's what's been missing, I think, with the public school system. That has been too focused on this idea of science, literature, and all that is about Western civilization. And that we need to acknowledge that Indigenous people also have their own history, their own philosophies, right? And their own traditional knowledge about the land and about science and about medicines. All this is now being incorporated. And not just that, because people have to live in Canada, they have to understand this country. So I'm going there to teach for 3 days. And I'm teaching about federalism, about confederation, talk about the Indian Act. I'm teaching about treaties. I'm teaching about colonization and the impact of that on our people's lives. I'm teaching about hydro-development, its impact on our people's lives. This is all part of a foundational education, essential to someone knowing where they come from. So, Einakina, who are you? Tandausigina, where do you come from? Tandetutian, where you're going. 3 basic things.
Very good. Well done, Ovid. Solange.
Perfect segue to some of the things that I'd also like to contribute as to how to move forward. And I think one of the questions that we have to consider, how does where you learn influence how you learn? How does where you learn influence how you learn? And so we have our leadership saying that they're honoring and acknowledging the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. When you look at Article 15.1, Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and in public information. What we need to role model is, what does that look like when our voice is represented? How do our students see themselves? How do they see themselves in the halls of their schools, on the walls, in what we put forward? How do they see themselves represented in the resources that we're using in the textbooks? And most importantly, how do they see themselves represented in the leadership in their schools? How can we say to our students, we need you here as our peers. We need you to be teachers alongside us. We need you to be in our leadership positions. And we need you to be contributing to this system excellence that we're really striving to create an incredible relational space for education, for learning, and for understanding. And so some of the things that we can consider in moving forward. one of the things is looking to see, from a Métis perspective, the inequity of funding and resources that are dedicated for Métis education in comparison to extensive resources for our Indigenous kin. So in the spirit of inclusivity and social change, we seek social equity and justice on par. Right now, for example, in my organization, it's a party of one right now, it's just me, and our Alberta Métis Education Council, three of them are PhD, one's PhD candidate, master's students. They're all holding leadership positions in their own educational communities, in their school authorities, but also in post-secondary. So how can we use resources so that it's not just a party of one and a volunteer body for a council? Another thing we need to consider is kind of making sure we have both wheels on the cart. How do we work with pre-service teachers in our faculties of education alongside our practicing teachers? And not only just our practicing teachers, but also our principals and our school system leaders, as well as our leadership in faculty. How can we all work together in that professional development? And I think there needs to be a systemic way of doing that. And one way to consider would be to start looking at competencies right from the early years. Look at competencies from early years, K to 12, post-secondary, as well as in the labor market force. And also considering, what does it look like when we have mentors? When we have mentors that can work with our students or with our teachers. We have mentors from our Métis community who can work with students entering post-secondary. They may be the first person in their family. How can that mentorship be there from the community? How can Métis mentors be involved with faculty and helping their professional development and learning and understanding so that it's coming from the community? And then also in the labor market force, again, how can we continually say that message to our young ones? We need you here. Often students decide by the time they're in grade 7 if they're even going to complete high school. How do we work with them so young to let them know and to raise that expectation within the system? You know, to start looking at the systemic gap as opposed to the self-identified achievement gap for our self-identified students. How do we make that shift? And I really believe that we can be doing that and working together. Right now, I really feel we're at a confluence where we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working in moving forward in reconciliation. So in that confluence, it's turbulent. We're learning as we go. I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is learn from each other's experience. If we can have a common knowledge and we can look at learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, learning to relate, and share what has worked well, share our achievements through our stories, our narrative. Sometimes sharing our success might be, I wouldn't do that again. I would do it differently next time, because sometimes those are our most powerful learning opportunities. So how can we do that in a systemic way so that that is an inherent part of the policy where we're listening to other communities, where I can share about my land-based learning that's happening at Métis Crossing in Alberta, where you can take the same idea, the same process, and the same learning that I had might apply to you as well. This isn't going to be just a regional one person, one answer community. We need to focus on the process and sharing that with each other. So in this place of hope, we see collaboration and ethical relationships as elemental landmarks in navigating the journey as we move forward in reconciliation.
Okay, if the mic carriers could get ready. We're now going to proceed to the next part of the event, which is to open the questions to the audience. And so if you could just, any could just raise their hands. There are 2 people who've got mics, and I'm even told they work. So if you could just raise your hand, we'll recognize you and you can ask a question. This is me. Okay, there you go. There's a young lady right there. Right there?
Okay.
Good
afternoon.
Well, then let's go. Okay, we'll go with you. But there's a number 2 is right over there, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you so much for your words so far, everyone. My name is Laura Foresight. I'm the Métis Inclusion Coordinator here at the University of Manitoba. I was going to ask a Métis-specific question, but I think you answered it very well already, so thank you. But I have one for the panel in terms of self-government and agreements towards education. So moving forward with negotiations for self-government agreements in regards to education for both First Nations and Métis communities, especially in Alberta, what do you hope to see enhance in their ability to empower their members and increase their success in the actual clauses of those agreements?
I think that question is to you.
So self-determination in education, is that the question? Yeah. I really think when we're talking about self-determination, it's about creating that space for voice. It is fundamentally about looking at what's already happening in your educational communities and looking to see how can we create in that confluence where we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous people coming together, how do we work in that space, in that confluence, in that turbulence to be able to move forward. And I think one of the really key pieces, because in education you'll hear about weaving in the perspectives or incorporating the knowledge or embodying the essence of Indigenous perspectives. I don't believe it works that way. If we're talking about self-determination, you're creating that relational space for that perspective to come in its entirety. You can't just take one piece. We need to look at the holistic ways of being, knowing, doing, and relating with one another. I also think, going back to the self-determination piece, it needs to go back to the community. You can have a regional perspective in a provincial context, but it begins with those conversations where we're approaching our parents and our community members as knowledge keepers of the hopes and dreams of our communities and our values and the hopes and dreams that we have for our children. I think if education systems approached our families and our communities in that way as those knowledge keepers, I think it would be a different conversation than talking about attendance or talking about behavior in class, or talking about academic achievement. How do we define success from a community perspective, I think, is the ultimate foundation of that.
Thank you very much. The young lady right here, yeah.
Thank you. Bonjour, Nindinawe Magnetok, Nicole Nindinakaz, Skomigizi Ikwe, Nindugo. Makwana Dudem, Winnipeg Nindunji, Métis, Cree, Anishinaabe, Nindao. I speak to you in one of my languages because I identify as Métis, Cree, and Anishinaabe, and I just want to bring forth the concept of how important language is in culture and in spirituality and reconciliation, and how to bring it forth in post-secondary institutions. I know the growing demand in elementary school and high schools and middle years is becoming huge. I was just at a Wasagamink during Reading Week in a Ojibwe immersion class, and it was amazing to me to see how many teachers were there that just knew hello and thank you, but were there to learn in a week-long time a bit of the language so that they could go into public schools and teach. So with over 430 graduates this year of Indigenous students and a whole influx of new ones coming up, in a post-secondary institution, and myself as a student pursuing my second degree, we really need to recognize the need. And I'm wondering as a student, how can I advocate as well as support this university moving forward with reconciling with languages and promoting study of languages within this institution?
Hello? Oh yeah, it works. If I hold it close to my mouth, it works. First of all, our people have to occupy the field of education. They can't leave it to the provincial government or to the universities to occupy the field for them. So it's about asserting your authority as a people, about regaining your autonomy as a nation. It's a higher goal, but it begins with jurisdiction. So the reason why, for example, our communities don't have authority of education is because it was given to denominational schools under the Indian Act, which gave the rise to the residential school system. So I think on a practical level on education itself, you have a great opportunity with a promise by the Prime Minister to enact legislation on Indigenous languages. Here's a chance for our people to rise up to the occasion, to be the leaders on what the legislation is going to say. And in particular, not just a promise to resurrect or revive the languages or to enhance them and develop them, but to make sure that the resources are there in a way that fiscal resources are there for the English language in the same manner that fiscal resources are there for French. So it's up to us now to get political about the Language Act and make sure that it says what it should say, including jurisdiction.
There's somebody right there. Okay, well then you take that person and then.
See if this is working. Buju anin in Dinaway Magnatok, Ujashko Mashkote, Bishike in Indigenous, Miknak Nindudem, Long Plain First Nation Nindunji. Hello, my name is Kristen Flattery, and my spirit name is Blue Buffalo Woman. I am the former female president of the Aboriginal Students Association. That is the new people over there. Okay, so my question is about how can we foster and initiate growth within. We need to foster and initiate growth within each student's unique abilities. Learning should be a concept you can use to express within your own medium. Students are coming unprepared to university with limited resources and limited accessible resources. They have not received an adequate education and they're not up to par with exams. Multiple choice questions are testing on more based on compliance. I'm just wondering if there is a way we can be closing the gap with these students. Like, can we be making better resources for them? Like, there's the 2% funding cap. So how can we be making better resources for these underprivileged families? And, or should we be reevaluating how we are evaluating our students that have gone through genocide? Sorry. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm the professor today. All right. I'll wear that hat for a second. Anyway, you were a leader of the student body, just like I was back then. And you involved a lot of reform. You created a lot of reform in the system. You enhanced the capacity for our people to graduate, right? And now you're asking what more can be done. Well, we have Migiziagamik. That wasn't there when I went through here. That came about under successive leaders like yourself. And it's an important institution within the university. It's our place within the grounds of these learned places, and it's used by our students to get together. But it's also used by Native Studies for certain orientations that they do. Now, what would help? Like, say, a single mother, for example. What would help a single mother would be a daycare center associated somehow to Migiziagamik, particularly for the unwed mothers or the single mothers. It'd be a great way of enhancing their capacity to attend classes, to do their studies, to hand in their assignments, and still look after their children. Right? It makes it easier for them if they can just come to school with their children and know that they're in a safe place and they don't have to worry about that. But the other thing is, when I came here, and you're right about that, like the quality of education is not at par with, say, urban centers. So you come here with less than prepared for university. And when I came in as a mature student, as a special mature student, right? Emphasis on special. Right? And I was allowed to take only 2 courses during the summer. And I met this person at the university, Ms. White was her name. Quite an interesting name, I thought. And I also thought she was a cigar-smoking woman, but because there were cigars on her desk, but I got it, they belonged to her boss, who was some administrator. And she said to me, I said, what would you like to take? So you need counseling, you need people that know what they're doing. And I said, well, I was good in math, I'd like to take math. And she said, no, you don't want to take math. So I ended up taking courses that what she thought would be more, say, I have a greater chance of passing them. So I took a course in, I forget now, anthropology, I think, something else. In fact, one of my professors is here, former professors, Professor Curry. I took a course from him on social conflict because that's something I could understand. And so in one of the few A's I got at university, by the way, thank you. And so like the reinforcement, like the reason why I turned to him is because the reinforcement is important. Like the word I got from the elder, Nipokao, Awa, this boy's smart, you know, that reinforcement. And then when I went to public school, I only remember one teacher, and her name was Mrs. Geppert. I'm not talking about her daughter, I'm talking about her, right? And then she said to me in confidence, I am surprised coming to Grand Rapids at the literary capacity of the students here. It's very high, right? That, even saying that alone gave me encouragement that, well, maybe I can read and write, maybe I can write, right? So, but when I ended up here, I was a slow reader, slow in everything, so I had to take speed reading and all these things. These are all essential needs because you have to scan your books and all that, right? And if you're a slow reader, it takes a long time. And if you're a slow speaker like Steve, it's even longer. But I think what needs to happen is this university is moving forward. Like they've graduated over 100 engineers, which is totally amazing. In my opinion, that's a great success, right? Any number of teachers and social workers, and a few lawyers, but we won't talk about them. Right? And some medical doctors. Kathy right here is from a graduate of the university, from my community, married into my community. And the institutions of higher learning have contributed a lot in terms of professional development. Like in my own community, I think we have over, how many healthcare workers? Over 24? More than 24. So we're self-contained in health. You see, we can provide the professional services people need, including doctors. And that's the goal. That should be the goal for every community. But the first step is making sure that when they arrive here, we build the ability for them, whatever it means, to succeed.
Hi, my name is Noah Wilson. I'm just the current, or I'm the new male co-president for UMass. I just wanted to acknowledge you and helping us, or helping create such a great student association on campus. And as a leader for a student advocacy group, it gives us an outlet to be a voice for the students. So, and second, I just want to acknowledge all the elders and all of the leaders here. Thank you for coming to University of Manitoba. It means a lot to the university that we're able to have such great leaders and able to speak to our community on campus. So I guess my question kind of stems from a question that was posed by you that I really identify with, is that one of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action was the 16th one, which is, it calls on post-secondary institutions to implement Aboriginal language and diplomas within post-secondary institutions. And with the National Truth and Reconciliation National Center on campus, as a student leader, I've heard from students across campus and speaking from you that we want a voice where we can actually have degrees and one of the quotes that Dr. Brokenleg, he came to the university a little while ago, and he said that culture continues through language. And I think that's very important at the university. And one thing I picked up from what you were saying earlier, and this is open to all of the leaders on the panel right now, is how do we, you said that we went from 11 to 25,000 students, which is absolutely amazing, self-declared Indigenous students. How do we reach out and empower those students? How do as leaders as yourself, how do you go into a community that's been damaged by intergenerational trauma, been damaged through residential schools, their confidence isn't where it should be because of these systems of oppression? how do you reach out to them? How do you empower communities that historically have been silenced by the system? So how do you, as leaders, what is the biggest obstacle for any of leaders, whether it be holding the confidence of the House of Commons, or being a premier, or being a leader within any faculty? How do you empower people around you as a leader?
Well, I was trying to stay out of it, but they deferred to me. I always try to talk about my own experiences. Otherwise, I'll end up trying to give a lot of advice with really no visible basis for doing so. But empowering people, as I said, the examples I gave are the ones that I know. That when I came out of residential school, I went home. And I said, nobody's ever going to send me away again. But I realized I didn't fit in because I was not 12 years old anymore. I wasn't 9, I was 18. And my parents didn't really have room for me in the house. And so I had to go out and do something for myself. And in the process of it, I realized how little I knew about the land, the fact that I didn't speak my language anymore. I didn't know how to hunt, and I didn't have any tools. And I ended up working with the chiefs, which let me travel, and traveling sometimes meant by boat, and sometimes staying in pretty remote communities for 1 to 2 weeks. And it meant talking to elders who only spoke one language. And so that became my school. The demands were that I should know the land, I should know the communities, I should know the rivers if I'm going to travel by boat, and I should know the language, and I should be able to speak it so I can connect to the people that are around me. And I think institutions are like that, you know, where you have engineers and doctors and nurses and teachers. Each of them in their profession should know something about the people they're going to serve. And they should have a good basis for knowing something about Indigenous people. They should know who the Cree are, and the Ojibwe, and the Métis, and the Inuit. Winnipeg is the center for many places, for many people. What do ambulance drivers, first responders know about the Indigenous people? I mean, what do they know when they pick you up and they take you away and they're dealing with you in emergency at hospitals? If they don't know you and they don't know your culture and your ways, then it's a handicap. You know, it's not our business to fit into their life. They have to respond to us and know how to do that. And so my own sense is institutions have to reach out and ask about what can we do to make this a more comfortable place for everybody. I went to university for about a year and a half, and I starved. I couldn't afford the food, and I couldn't afford to pass up all the beer that was available. And so I only survived for a year and a half, and then I couldn't continue anymore. And as it was anyway, I got called home to work for the elders on the Indigenous issues of the day, which was the pipeline. So empowerment, for me, I think there's too many of our people who don't know the language and don't know what to do about it. I noticed something, and I talked about spirituality. There's a lot of people I know that know how to drum and know drum songs, but they don't know the spiritual power of it. That when you're singing these songs and you're drumming these songs, you're calling the person that first made that song. It might be 1,000 years ago, it might be 5,000 years ago, it might have been 2 years ago. It's calling on all your ancestors and you shouldn't be doing it mindlessly. The spiritual power of some of the things we do, we don't acknowledge. And I say that because I didn't acknowledge that. And now I'm learning these things. I'm learning I know the songs, I grew up with them, but I don't know where they came from. And I'm just really learning how to pray and connect to myself again. And I talk about spirituality, and I would say all it means is to connect to everything there is in the universe. Everything there is in the universe, to have a relationship and to know what it is, that's spirituality. And so if you don't have that, I think you're handicapped. I was handicapped most of my life. I think that's the most important thing for me to see. That's empowerment of Indigenous people. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Anin, Tanse, howdy. Alan Kershane is my Christian name. Makate Makwa Dishnikas, that is my Anishinaabe name, Black Bear. Alan and Margaret Dunji, I am from a product of Alan and Margaret, my parents. I reside in the Sagging area. I just have a question here. You always hear the word reconciliation, and I always think, well, how can we reconcile when right now there is still cultural genocide that's going on with the Child and Family Services of 90% of our kids from Manitoba are in care and placed in homes that are not of Anishinaabe descent. Like, we talk cultural reconciliation, but it's not happening. Shouldn't cultural reconciliation happen at the school level where we're educating all of our kids in Manitoba and in Canada about the impacts of how our Anishinaabe children were in residential school and how it's still happening with the Child and Family Services? Shouldn't that happen? How about bilingual? When we have bilingual schools here, province and the federal government are at the whim to provide as much cash as they want to give these schools, but when we are trying to find identity for these Anishinaabe schools, Cree, Dene, Soto, Ojibwe, it's hard to find dollars. And with the funding that is provided for the schools, for all Aboriginal schools, and they're starting to make progress now. I know, like in Alberta, they started that good school division. Their Northland School Division was one of the first school divisions started by Pierre DePola. He was Interlake superintendent from Manitoba that started this school division with First Nation schools and Métis schools. 23 schools, 26 schools in that school division, and now they're still functioning as a division with parity, where they're accessing dollars from both the federal and provincial government, where they'll be able to provide the language programs. Reconciliation happening there because they're teaching kids what happened to our kids across Canada with residential school and how we're still seeing cultural genocide with Child and Family Service. Just another policy by government for our kids to be taken and losing their identity. So how do we address that when we talk? We always talk reconciliation. Is it really happening?
Okay. That's a very important question about children, about making sure that they remain within the community and their families. And it predates, the answer predates the 60s scoop. It's about how families were intact. I like that word, intact, because it says it all. But we can't blame the agencies now, like the way they're functioning. I'll tell you why. I was involved in negotiating those agreements for the North on child welfare. And our objective was for the Government of Canada and the province to recognize our autonomy over children and families. We wanted to make sure that we provided the services that the children and families needed to remain together and to be well together. We didn't succeed in convincing the province or the federal government that they had to recognize our jurisdiction as a people. our traditions and culture. Instead, they imposed the Child Welfare Act on us. But what we said was at that time, well, it's better for us to run it than for them to run it. And then we tried also to focus on prevention, the treatment of families, the reclamation of the family itself, recognizing that some people are beyond reclamation, but the fact is you still try to work with people to look after their family. We didn't succeed in convincing the federal government to fund prevention. What they insisted on was funding protection. So the institution did not reform. The structure remained the same. The funding formula didn't change. And the result is what we have now. So the only difference is that the agencies are native in name, run by our own people, but the system is the same. So it's a very important question, and one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most immediate challenges facing us as a people is not to destroy it, but to reform it, to get back to the basics that we were trying to accomplish when we were negotiating the idea of autonomy, our culture, and our family traditions, and the restoration of the family unit, right? So that's the question you raise is very important. And schools of social work are here. You know, they try to teach about family from our perspective too. So the education system is there to accomplish it, but it's an institutional problem. It's a legal problem. It's a jurisdictional issue. It's about autonomy. And they want to hang on to it, and we want to wrestle it away from them, and that fight is not complete. So I'd like to talk to you afterwards, because I think we've got to do something about this on the political front.
Sorry, I gave it away, and they won't give it back. I really have we've only time for one more question, and I'm sorry, but I think that the person was right in there. That yes, I'll make you a deal. I'm a liberal. I give up easily. We'll ask. That'll make you the last question after him. But I'm going to ask you something. Please make the questions very short, and if the answers could be short, it would be helpful.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Anderson. I'm from Fox Lake Cree Nation. I grew up in Gila, Manitoba. I'm a University of Manitoba student graduating a couple of days. I worked for Fox Lake as a band administrator, so I'm aware of how they get their funding. And we had students attending Gillum School, run by Frontier School Division, that were living on reserve. So I was able to compare the funding levels between the reserve school and non-reserve school. So when Mr. Mercredi was talking about we need to address the dropout rates, I think there's a systemic problem right there where the funding to the First Nations for education is much lower than it is for, Frontier School Division. It's approximately 40 to 50% less. So we need to look at the bureaucracy where they determine the funding by formula rather than, we need to look at some other way to convince the bureaucracy that we need more funding to be able to attract more teachers to come to the reserve, because Fox Lake just experienced a situation where there is no teachers there to teach the students. So how do we go about increasing the funding for First Nations for education purposes?
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to take, before you answer the question, we'll take the last question, and then somebody could handle both questions.
Thank you. Sorry, my question is regarding deficit level thinking. And I know today we heard a story about a 23-year-old who was ready to go out and change the world and take back his community and take back his land, their land. And I think a lot of people, when we were hearing the story, laughed. as if it's incomprehensible how someone could be so idealistic, not only 43 years ago, but today. So I'm just wondering, how can we change, because how can we change that?
Okay. Over to the three of you. Yes, go ahead.
I think there are two questions that we can ask: what if and if only. What if you had access to any resource, what would that resource be? And if only we were doing one thing differently, what would that be? And then if we each have an opportunity to go through that imagining process together, and learning from each other and hearing what success looks like, because that's really what we're doing when we answer those questions, what if and if only. It's an entry into the imagination part, where we're not saying, I have the right answer for everybody and everyone should do it this way. And I think when we talk about policy and programming, that's often what people think should happen. But I think we need to live. I mean, I have an $8 million world to start. I know exactly what I would do if I had $8 million in our province. I have an $80 million world too, and that's like really exciting. But you have to start that visioning process and work with your community. That thinking and imagining and visioning has been done, with our Alberta Métis Education Council and our leadership. And yeah, that's my idea.
Either of you?
I could make a remark. We talk like everything is normal. It's just that we come from a different place, so we have to fine-tune some things. The fact is, Indigenous people in this country have been through an incredible amount of pain, deprivation in the last few hundred years. Just talking for myself. I was sexually abused as a 9-year-old. I was beaten, I was whipped, I was starved. And I turned on my father. I blamed him for what I went through. I don't want to have anything to do with my mother. I grew up separately from my brothers and sisters. And, I went to university and I thought, I'm going to do something, but the amount of pain and anger and everything inside me was too much. I couldn't do that. And I imagine it's probably like that for a lot of young people as well. And you look at the thousands of kids that are taken away from their parents. I mean, it should be as absolutely the last resort that you take kids away from their parents, because it unleashes lifelong scars and the pain and the anger and the rage that instills it. It's immeasurable. So there is a lot of work to be done, and again, there's immediate things that have to be done, And I would say in the Second World War, we bombed the bejesus out of Germany, and no sooner was it over, we pumped hundreds of millions of dollars in to rebuild it. We did the same thing with Japan. That's what it's called for with Indigenous people. We have been devastated. We've been pushed to the brink of extinction. And it calls for no less. We need reconciliation. We need people to acknowledge in this country what happened to us and what's still happening to us today. And it calls for extraordinary measures. It calls for extraordinary measures. So that's kind of my own response to what happened. Thank you.
One of those extraordinary measures is recognizing Indigenous people's self-determination, their right to autonomy, so they can have jurisdiction over children and family, on land and resources and so on. And one of the first political leaders in Canada to recognize our people are having the inherent right to govern themselves is standing right there, Paul Martin. And when that became public knowledge to us as political leaders, we were empowered by that awareness that there were people within government, with authority within the federal system, who were prepared to walk with us and work with us to assert our jurisdiction on different topics, right? The other extraordinary measure has to do with the question you raised about land. You cannot leave our people with the reserve system as it is. It's less than 1% of the land mass of this country. It is impossible for any nation, regardless how brilliant it may be, to exercise self-determination on small parcels of land, to make a livelihood from their people from reservations that are so small with no resources. So land is part of it. Getting the land back to the communities. And I'll tell you a story just to make a point. I was invited to the Navajo Nation Assembly one time, and I had the privilege of traveling across their country in a car. One full day of travel at regular speeds because there's cops around. It took me a full day to cross their territory. Now, if you bring that same vehicle to Grand Rapids, and once you cross that bridge along the Saskatchewan River, and you exit on top of the hill, you've traveled 5 minutes. See, the Americans, although they committed cultural and physical genocide against the Indian tribes, at least did one thing right. They allowed them to have their land, much more than the Canadian government did. So that's to me, that reconciliation is not about forgiveness. It's really about purposeful act, like giving back land. Because how is it possible for my community? We have no more land. We're a muskeg reserve. We're a muskeg reserve. We have no land to build, even for housing. We're maxed out. And yet, when I look around in terms of the province and the municipal governments, they have these incredible boundaries which are given to them by legislation, by the province. Like, say, the town of Thompson, or even the town of Nipawin would have a greater land base than my reserve. And to me, that's a foundation for carrying on with finger pointing, because that's all I can do right now, because I don't have the authority to give myself more land, right? Because that's been taken away from us, illegally, mind you. We don't have that power to just expand our land base unless we want a war or something. And our people are not inclined to do that. So it's really incumbent upon Canadians to recognize that we need more land, right? And one more thing, we're not the only people with treaties. The Mennonites had a treaty when they first came here. They were given reserves just south of here. But at some point, they must have abandoned the idea of reserves because it became fee simple, like private land. I don't advocate the reserves becoming fee simple. I'm not talking about private property, more private lands. I'm talking about collective lands for the Cree people as a Cree nation, having title to their land. Not Canada having title, but the Cree nation having title, or the Anishinaabe nation having title to their land base. So that requires, in your case as a Canadian, a leap of faith that this is the right thing to do. Right? But ultimately the power will be in the provincial government or the federal government cooperating with us in coming to that decision, that reconciliation means reallocating land to create a livelihood and a place for our people to grow and develop as nations. Because we were disrupted as a people. We were not extinguished, as he said. We were disrupted. And our moment is coming. But it needs the cooperation of Canadians and their governments for that moment to happen. Our what I call our golden moment as a people is arriving.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I've got to say that we've gone over time, but I must say, hearing what I've just heard from the last three speakers, it was worth it to go. It was worth it going over time. Let me just say that this has been a tremendous couple of hours. I want to thank you, Dr. Bernard. I want to thank the university. I got to tell you, however, there is one flaw in today, and that is that we've been given some remarkable insights. We've heard some stuff that's very important. But the fact is, you're here because you're interested in this issue. And the real problem is the hundreds of thousands of people who should hear this, of Canadians who should hear this message, are not here. And they're not going to hear this message because they're not going to be going to these meetings. And we've got to reach out. Those of us who believe as strongly as we do in the issues that you've just heard here or the questions that you have just heard, we have got to reach out. I speak a lot across the country, and one of the things that stuns me is especially on some of the smaller centers in Canada, and I go in and I usually ask if I'm going to come, I say, could you please invite people from the local community, First Nations community? And they come and they meet each other for the first time, people who've lived together for a couple of 100 years, who go to the same, I don't care, Tim Hortons or whatever you want to do, and they don't know each other, they don't know anything about each other. And I think there is a responsibility on the First Nations, on the Métis Nation, and on the Inuit to reach out to these people, let them hear the message that we have heard here. Dr. Bernard, I congratulate you on today. It has been a tremendous success. I said at the beginning of this that I thought this was the most important, this was the largest moral issue we faced as a country. It is one that is going to determine who we are and what our values are. It is one by which the rest of the world ultimately is going to join us. But if you also think that economically that this is not an important issue, let me just say, over there are a bunch of young people. Take a look at them, and you're going to say to them that they're the future of this country. Well, I'll tell you, that's not true. If you looked at the Statistics Canada report that came out yesterday, the future of this country is my generation. There are more of us than there are of them. And I've got to say, that's got to scare the living bejesus out of you. So, what I'm really saying to you, what I'm really saying is that there are more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 15. The fastest growing segment of those under the age of 15 are Indigenous Canadians. They have got to be given every shot if this country is going to succeed. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure what there is to say. Many of us are here exactly as Mr. Martin reminded us, because we care about this issue, because we are bound together for a future in this country, and this university finds it a very important part of who we are and what we are. I consider, Solange and I just met today, I consider the other panelists and Mr. Martin to be friends of this university, personal friends. Thank you all for being here. We each, I think, carry in ourselves a broad sense of what community in this country can be, and a commitment to what all of these visitors to our campus today have encouraged us to do. Thank you.